My mother-in-law shoved a cheap white apron against my custom silk wedding gown and announced to 200 guests that it was time I learned my place by serving 30 men their dinner. When I handed it back and said no, my groom grabbed my arm and slapped me across the face twice. He thought a public humiliation would break me into submission. Instead, I took the microphone, canceled the reception on the spot, and triggered a chain of events that would dismantle his entire family empire. Before I tell you exactly how I destroyed the Sterling family, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to burn down a room to save yourself. The silence in the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was so absolute that I could hear the hum of the crystal chandeliers above us. Just a moment ago, the string quartet had been playing. Now every eye was fixed on me and Beatrice Sterling. She stood perfectly upright in her designer gown, holding a white serving apron trimmed with ridiculous blue lace. She pushed it into my waist. "The new bride serves the Sterling men their first meal," Beatrice announced into a silver microphone. Her voice echoed off the gilded walls, dripping with false sweetness. "It is a family tradition. It teaches a woman that a strong marriage is built when she understands whom she serves. You are our family us woman now, Chloe. Put it on." I stared at the apron, my mind racing to process the absurdity of the moment. I am Chloe Adams. I am 32 years old and the CEO of Apex Medical Billing, a company I built entirely from the ground up in a windowless office. I do not come from generational wealth. I do not have a trust fund, but my bank accounts are entirely my own and they are heavy. Julian Sterling, the man I had just married 2 hours ago, was supposed to be a polished investment director at his family U.S. firm, Sterling Holdings. He played the part of the perfect supportive New York heir flawlessly for 2 years. As Beatrice held the apron against my dress, a cold realization began to take root in my chest. Just 3 days ago, I had written a personal check for $80,000 to cover the final catering and venue costs for this exact room. Julian had kissed my forehead, apologizing profusely, claiming his family U.S. trust disbursements were temporarily tied up in a bureaucratic legal review. I paid for the steak those 30 men were about to eat. I paid for the champagne in their glasses, and now I was being ordered to serve them. The senselessness of it was staggering. I looked past Beatrice to the long head table. 30 men sat there. Julian, us uncles, his cousins, the board members of Sterling Holdings. They all had empty plates. They were waiting for me. I scanned the smaller tables near the walls where the women had been banished. I caught the eye of Zoe Julian, U.S. sister-in-law. Zoe is a brilliant African-American woman who had married Julian, U.S. older brother Pierce 5 years ago. She had always maintained a quiet, guarded distance at family dinners, silently enduring Beatrice, U.S. endless polite insults. Right now, Zoe looked horrified. She subtly shook her head at me. I turned to Julian. He was standing right beside his mother, his jaw tight. I waited for him to step in to laugh it off, to protect me the way a husband should. He leaned in close, his breath hot against my ear. "Just do it, Chloe," he whispered sharply. "It takes 10 minutes. Stop making a scene." "I am not doing this," I whispered back, keeping my voice steady. I handed the apron back to Beatrice. Julian, U.S. hand shot out. His fingers wrapped around my bicep, biting into my skin with terrifying force. Beatrice gasped loudly into the microphone, making sure the entire room heard. She called me ungrateful. She said I was ruining their sacred tradition. I felt my pulse hammering in my throat, but I refused to shrink. I looked directly into Julian, U.S. eyes. "I hired a professional catering staff," I said evenly, loud enough for the people at the front tables to hear. "I am not playing servant to 30 grown men on my wedding day. Let go of my arm, Julian." His face contorted. The charming, sophisticated man I had loved vanished completely. In his place was a stranger cornered by his own rage. The first slap was so fast and forceful that my vision flashed white. My head snapped to the side. A collective gasp ripped through the ballroom. The heavy diamond pin holding my veil tore loose and clattered onto the marble floor. Before I could even register the stinging heat spreading across my cheek, his hand came down a second time, harder. My ears rang. Someone screamed. A chair scraped violently against the floor as security guards from the event company I hired began running toward the front. Julian stood breathing heavily, his chest heaving, waiting for me to crumble, waiting for me to cry and beg for forgiveness in front of his powerful family. But I did not cry. My background in medical billing taught me one crucial thing. When the system crashes, you do not panic. You isolate the problem, you lock down the assets, and you take control. I turned my back on Julian. I walked straight up to Beatrice, reached out, and ripped the microphone from her manicured hand. She stumbled backward in shock. I turned to face the 200 guests. My cheek was burning, but my voice was absolute ice. "The reception is over," I said. The speakers carried my words into every corner of the room. 2 hours ago, I promised to love and honor this man. I did not promise to become his maid, and I certainly did not agree to be a punching bag for a fragile ego. Every single one of you just watched Julian Sterling assault me because I said the word no. I am asking you all to leave immediately. Julian lunged forward to grab the microphone, but 2 massive security guards stepped between us, shoving him back. Beatrice started screaming that I was insane, that I was hysterical, but nobody was listening to her anymore. The room erupted into chaos. Guests were grabbing their coats. Zoe was already on her feet, pulling her young son toward the exit, giving me one last unreadable look before she disappeared into the crowd. I did not wait for the police to arrive at the venue. I did not want a public circus in a hotel lobby. I needed to get to a secure location. My event manager, a woman I had trusted for years, rushed to my side with my coat and purse. I reached behind my neck, unhooked the tiny hidden clasps of my custom gown, and let the heavy silk pool onto the floor right in front of the head table. I had worn a simple white athletic set underneath for comfort, anticipating a long night of dancing. Instead, it became my armor. I walked out of the Plaza Hotel in my sneakers and a trench coat, leaving the ruins of the Sterling family dignity on the floor behind me. I climbed into the back of a waiting black town car. The doors locked. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows as we sped away. My chest was tight with adrenaline and grief, but my mind was rapidly organizing the next steps. I needed to call my lawyer. I needed to change my locks. Then my phone vibrated in my purse. It was an automated alert from my primary banking app. I pulled it out and stared at the glowing screen in the dark back seat. My stomach dropped completely. Withdrawal alert. Transfer of $150,000 from your joint wedding account to an external Sterling Holdings account has been completed. I stared at the numbers. That account held the entirety of our wedding cash gifts, plus a massive emergency fund I had set aside for our honeymoon and first year of shared expenses. Julian had just drained it. He did not do it in a fit of rage after the argument. The timestamp on the transfer was from exactly 20 minutes ago. I was executing a wire transfer on his phone at the exact same moment his mother was handing me that apron. The slap was not just about obedience. It was a distraction. It was a calculated trap, and I had just walked right into the middle of a massive financial slaughter. I looked at the cheap fabric in my hands and felt a cold wave of absolute clarity wash over me. I am a CEO. I built Apex Medical Billing from a cramped apartment into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. I negotiate with ruthless hospital administrators and corporate lawyers every single day. I do cower for no one, and I certainly do not serve a room full of men who expect my submission as an appetizer. I held the apron out toward Beatrice. "No," I said. My voice was calm and steady. "I will not be wearing this, and I will not be serving anyone." Beatrice let out a sharp gasp, her hand flying to her chest as if I had just struck her. The low murmur of conversation in the ballroom instantly died. 200 guests held their breath. That was when Julian stepped forward. His handsome face, the one I had kissed at the altar just hours ago, twisted into a mask of pure, ugly entitlement. He leaned in so close I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. "Stop embarrassing my family," he hissed through clenched teeth. His voice, a venomous whisper, meant only for me. "Put the apron on Chloe. Now." I stepped back, putting distance between us. "I am not doing this, Julian. I paid $80,000 for professional catering. Your family can wait for the servers." Before the last word even left my mouth, Julian lunged. His hand shot out and clamped down on my upper arm. His fingers dug into my flesh with a brutal, bruising force. The pain was sharp and sudden. He yanked me toward him, completely ignoring the gasps from the guests in the front row. "You are going to do exactly what my mother tells you," he growled, the polished veneer of the Sterling air shattering completely. "You are my wife now. You do not get to say no." Adrenaline flooded my veins. I planted my heels into the marble floor and violently wrenched my arm free from his grip. "Do not ever touch me like that again," I said, my voice ringing out clear and loud across the silent room. Julian U.S. eyes went dark. The fury in his expression was something I had never seen in our 2 years together. He did not hesitate. He did not look around to see who was watching. He simply raised his hand and struck me. The first slap hit my left cheek with the force of a swinging door. The sharp crack echoed against the high ceilings of the ballroom. The impact snapped my head to the side, sending a shockwave of pain through my jaw. I stumbled sideways, my high heels catching on the heavy silk of my gown. Someone in the crowd screamed. A wine glass shattered on the floor. I barely had time to process the blinding sting on my face before he struck me again. The second slap was harder, fueled by pure, unhinged rage. His heavy gold watch caught the side of my head. The force ripped the diamond comb from my hair, tearing my veil completely loose. It fluttered to the floor like a surrendered flag. My ears were ringing. A hot metallic taste filled my mouth. For one surreal second, the entire world seemed to move in slow motion. I looked out at the sea of 200 guests. Women had their hands clamped over their mouths. Men were frozen in their seats. At the head table, the board members of Sterling Holdings stared at me with cold, calculating eyes, waiting to see if I would fall to my knees and cry. They expected me to break. They expected me to run away in shame or drop to the floor in tears. But they chose the wrong woman to humiliate. I slowly turned my head back to face Julian. My cheek was burning red, but I did not shed a single tear. I stood up perfectly straight, squared my shoulders, and looked him dead in the eye. The ringing in my ears faded into the deafening silence of 200 guests staring at me. They expected tears. They expected me to crumble to the floor to cover my face, to beg for forgiveness, to save the evening. But I did not shed a single tear. My cheek burned with a furious heat, but my mind was colder and clearer than it had ever been. I turned my back on Julian and walked with absolute purpose toward the terrified master of ceremonies. I reached out and pulled the silver microphone firmly from his trembling hands. A sharp burst of audio feedback echoed through the grand ballroom, making several of the Sterling board members flinch in their seats. I looked out at the sea of shocked faces, keeping my voice completely steady. This wedding is canceled. 2 hours ago, I vowed to love and honor that man. I did not vow to become his family servant, and I absolutely did not vow to be a punching bag for his fragile ego. Every single person in this room just watched Julian Sterling hit me twice because I refused to obey his mother. I want you all to remember exactly what you saw tonight. The reception is over. I suggest you all leave. Julian let out a furious shout. He lunged across the polished dance floor, his face twisted in rage, desperate to tear the microphone away from me and silence the truth. He never made it. 2 massive security guards stepped directly into his path, crossing their arms and forming an unbreakable wall between us. I had personally paid for the premium event security out of my own Apex Medical Billing Company accounts, and they were answering to my contract, not his family name. Julian slammed into their chests and was instantly shoved backward, stumbling awkwardly in his expensive tuxedo. Beatrice began shrieking from the head table, pointing a shaking finger at me and demanding that someone call the police to have me removed for ruining their reputation. I did not even grant her the dignity of a glance. I handed the microphone back to the stunned MC. Then I did the one thing they never expected. I reached to the back of my neck and unhooked the hidden clasp of my custom silk wedding gown. I reached behind my waist and pulled the heavy zipper down the length of my spine. I let the expensive fabric slide off my shoulders and fall into a massive, heavy pool of white silk on the marble floor. Gasps erupted from the crowd as people covered their mouths in shock. I stepped out of the dress wearing only the black athletic sports bra and compression shorts I had worn underneath for comfort. I had built a successful business from nothing, surviving on my own grit. I did not need their money, I did not need their legacy, and I certainly did not need to be trapped in a dress that now felt like a prison uniform. Without another word, I grabbed my coat and purse from the sweetheart table, turned my back on the entire Sterling family, and walked straight down the center aisle of the ballroom. I walked out of the Plaza Hotel in my athletic wear and sneakers, leaving my expensive wedding and my abusive groom behind me. I pushed through the heavy gold revolving doors, stepped into the cool New York night, and got straight into my waiting car. The heavy doors of the town car slammed shut, shutting out the chaos of the Plaza Hotel. I sank into the leather seat and told the driver to just drive anywhere. As the car merged into the busy Manhattan traffic, I finally let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for an hour. My left cheek was throbbing, a hot and painful reminder of the man I had just married. I stared out the tinted window, watching the city lights blur past in the dark. I was trying to process the humiliation, the betrayal, and the sheer speed at which my perfect life had unraveled. I told myself it was over. I had stood up for myself and walked away. I thought the worst part of the night was behind me. Then the phone in my purse vibrated. It was a single sharp buzz. I reached into my bag with shaking hands and pulled it out. The screen lit up the dark back seat of the car. It was an automated high-priority alert from my primary banking application. I stared at the bright text on the screen and my blood ran completely cold. Withdrawal alert. A transfer of $150,000 from your joint wedding account to an external Sterling Holdings account has been completed. I blinked, hoping my eyes were playing tricks on me in the dark. But the numbers did not change. That joint account held every single cash gift we had received from the wedding guests. More importantly, it held the massive contingency fund I had personally deposited from my business to cover our month-long honeymoon and our first year of shared expenses. It was almost entirely my money, and Julian had just drained every last cent of it. A sickening wave of nausea washed over me. I tapped the notification to open the full digital receipt. My eyes scanned down to the bottom of the screen to check the exact time of the transaction. The timestamp made my heart stop beating. The transfer was initiated exactly 4 minutes ago. 4 minutes ago, I was standing in the center of that ballroom holding the microphone. 4 minutes ago, Julian was supposedly blinded by uncontrollable anger, throwing a violent temper tantrum in front of his powerful family and 200 guests. I dropped the phone onto the leather seat next to me. The slap was not a sudden loss of control. The humiliation with the apron was not just a cruel and outdated family tradition. It was a highly calculated distraction. He wanted me to fight back. He wanted a public scene so chaotic and so shocking that no one would notice him pulling out his phone to liquidate our entire financial safety net while I was busy defending my physical safety and my dignity. I looked out at the city skyline and realized with absolute horror that I had not just escaped a bad marriage. I had walked right into the middle of a massive financial trap. I woke up the next morning with the intention of driving straight to the police station, but before I could even pour a cup of coffee, my phone began buzzing so violently it nearly vibrated right off the kitchen counter. I had 84 missed calls and hundreds of notifications. I opened my social media apps and felt the air completely leave my lungs. I was trending across the internet. Julian and Beatrice had not wasted a single second. They had released a highly edited video of the wedding reception across every major platform. The footage showed me throwing my wedding dress onto the floor and shouting into the microphone, but they had completely cut out the part where Julian grabbed my arm and struck my face. The caption Beatrice wrote was perfectly crafted to destroy my character. She claimed I had suffered a severe manic episode after drinking too heavily on an empty stomach. She told the world that I had become physically aggressive and verbally abusive toward my new in-laws simply because I felt too important to participate in a harmless family tradition. They painted me as an unstable and greedy woman who had lost her mind at the altar. But the smear campaign did not stop at my personal reputation. Within hours, a coordinated army of fake accounts began carpet-bombing my company Apex Medical Billing with one-star reviews. People who had never even stepped foot in my office were suddenly claiming we stole their money and ruined their medical credit. Julian was trying to bleed my business dry and ruin my livelihood before I could even defend myself. Most brides would have locked their doors and cried in bed. But I am not most brides. I put on a tailored suit, drove straight to my office, and gathered my entire crisis management and IT security team in the main conference room. This is where the difference between Julian and me became glaringly obvious. Julian was a spoiled rich boy who only knew how to solve problems by throwing his family money at public relations firms and hiding behind his mother. He inherited his power and his title. I built my empire from absolutely nothing. I spent the last 10 years navigating the ruthless world of corporate medical billing, fighting off predatory insurance companies, and negotiating massive contracts from a windowless basement office. I knew how to fight in the dark. I stood at the head of the conference table and gave my team clear and precise orders. We instructed our legal department to send immediate cease and desist letters to the platforms hosting the manipulated video. I had my IT lead run diagnostic traces on the fake reviews to prove they originated from paid bot farms that we could link directly back to Sterling Holdings. I did not panic when the kitchen caught on fire. I simply locked the doors and prepared to suffocate the flames. Julian thought he was dealing with an emotional and broken bride. He had no idea that he had just declared war on a CEO. I was still in the conference room, reviewing server logs, when my lawyer Harper Reed walked in. Her expression was completely unreadable as she tossed a thick manila envelope onto the center of the glass table. A process server had just dropped it off at the front desk. I assumed it was an annulment filing or a legal threat regarding my public statements. But when I pulled out the heavy stack of legal documents, I had to read the first page 3 times just to comprehend the absolute audacity of what I was looking at. Julian had filed an emergency restraining order against me. The man who had bruised my arm and struck my face in front of 200 people was now legally demanding state protection from me. I flipped through the sworn affidavit, feeling my blood pressure rise with every sentence. Julian and his high-priced lawyers had crafted a masterful piece of total fiction. He claimed that my behavior at the wedding was the climax of months of severe emotional abuse and unhinged aggression. He painted himself as a terrified victim who had been manipulated and trapped by a calculated gold-digging bride. According to his sworn statement, he only grabbed my arm at the reception because I was allegedly about to physically attack his mother in a drunken rage. The lies were sickening, but the strategy was undeniable. It was a brilliant and utterly ruthless legal strike. By filing for a protective order first, he was completely controlling the legal narrative. If I went to the police now to report the physical assault, I would look like a vindictive wife filing a desperate retaliatory claim. He was trying to back me into a corner where any move I made would make me look guilty. Harper watched me read the documents, waiting for me to break down or panic. Instead, I carefully placed the papers back onto the table and took a deep breath. Julian thought he was outsmarting me. He thought the legal system was a weapon only rich men like him knew how to wield. He was about to learn a very hard lesson. Harper and I were sitting in the absolute silence of my office, staring at the restraining order when my personal cell phone began to vibrate. The screen displayed an unknown caller ID. Under normal circumstances, I would have let it go to voicemail, but my instincts told me to pick it up. I answered the call and held the phone to my ear. At first, there was only the sound of heavy breathing and the faint echo of passing cars. Then a woman spoke. It was Zoe. Zoe was Julian's older brother's wife. She was a brilliant African-American woman who had spent the last 5 years quietly observing every toxic dynamic in the Sterling family while enduring Beatrice's thinly veiled microaggressions at Sunday dinners. Zoe never spoke out of turn, but right now her voice was urgent and completely stripped of her usual polite restraint. She told me to listen carefully and not to interrupt. She said to meet her in 30 minutes at the underground parking garage of the downtown public library. She warned me strictly not to take my own car because Julian might be tracking the GPS. Before I could ask her why she was risking her own position in the family to help me, she said something that made the blood freeze in my veins. "Chloe," she whispered over the line, "that slap at the wedding had nothing to do with family tradition, and it had nothing to do with you talking back." Beatrice and Julian knew exactly what they were doing. They intentionally humiliated you. They wanted to push you into a complete mental breakdown. They needed you so emotionally shattered and distracted that you would not bother reading the financial paperwork they were going to force you to sign the next morning. The line went dead. I lowered the phone slowly as a horrifying new reality crashed over me. I had spent the last 24 hours believing I was the victim of an abusive and controlling groom. I was wrong. I was the target of a massive corporate conspiracy. I took an unmarked cab to the downtown public library and walked down the concrete ramp into the underground parking garage. The air was damp and cold. I spotted a plain gray sedan parked in the darkest corner of the lowest level. The passenger door unlocked with a heavy click. I pulled my coat tight and slid into the front seat. Zoe did not waste time with pleasantries. The polished and quiet woman from the family dinners was completely gone. In her place was a razor-sharp former auditor who had spent years silently observing a family of predators. Without saying a word, she handed me a thick, heavy folder. "Open it," she said, her voice steady in the quiet car. I opened the folder. Inside were dozens of pages of highly confidential bank statements and internal ledgers. My eyes quickly scanned the balance sheets, and the numbers made absolutely no sense. Sterling Holdings was supposed to be a massive and powerful investment firm. But the accounts were completely drained. They were drowning in toxic debt. "They have been completely bankrupt for 8 months," Zoe said quietly, watching my face. "They are living on hidden credit lines and borrowed time. Julian did not marry you because he loved you, Chloe. He married you because Apex Medical Billing is the only clean and profitable asset he could get his hands on." I stared at the documents, trying to process the magnitude of the lie. But then I turned to the next page, and my heart stopped beating completely. It was a commercial lending agreement for a $5 million bridge loan. The borrower was Sterling Holdings. The listed collateral was my company Apex Medical Billing, and at the bottom of the page, right next to the signature of Julian Sterling, was my own signature, or at least a very good forgery of it. I did not sign this, I whispered, my hands gripping the paper so hard my knuckles turned white. He forged my name. Zoe nodded. He forged the preliminary guarantee 3 weeks ago to secure the initial credit line, but the bank required the final executed documents to be signed in person by both spouses the morning after the wedding to release the rest of the funds. That is why Beatrice handed you that apron, Chloe. I looked up at her as the horrifying truth finally snapped into place. It was a psychological test, Zoe explained, her voice filled with absolute disgust. Beatrice told Julian that independent women like you need to be broken before they hand over their power. They planned to humiliate you so severely in front of 200 guests that your spirit would be completely crushed. If they could force you to put on that apron and serve 30 men in your wedding gown, they knew you would wake up the next morning feeling so small and so defeated that you would blindly sign a stack of marital paperwork without daring to ask a single question. The apron, the slap, the public spectacle. None of it was about family tradition or my attitude. It was a calculated corporate strategy to steal $5 million and take my entire company. Julian did not just want to abuse me, he wanted to own me. I closed the folder and felt a new kind of energy replace the shock. It was pure, unadulterated rage. I looked at Zoe sitting in the driver's seat. She was risking her entire life by handing me these stolen documents. If Julian or Beatrice found out, they would use their expensive lawyers to destroy her. I asked her why she was doing this, why she was handing me the matches to burn her own family down. Zoe gripped the steering wheel and looked straight ahead into the dark concrete garage. She told me that she had spent 5 years suffocating inside the Sterling family. 5 years of Beatrice making calculated comments about her hair, her skin, and her background. 5 years of Julian making arrogant jokes at holiday dinners about how fortunate she was that they welcomed an African-American woman from a working-class neighborhood into their elite circle. They treated her like a diversity charity project while secretly draining the family trust funds to cover their massive corporate failures. She explained that her husband Pierce was a decent man, but a weak one. Beatrice and Julian had turned him into a corporate puppet. They used his name on the board of directors to shield themselves from legal liability while keeping him completely in the dark about the bankruptcy. They gave him a corner office and a title but stripped him of any real power. Zoe turned to look at me, and her eyes were filled with a fierce maternal rage. She told me she had a young son. She said she absolutely refused to let her boy grow up in a house where cruelty was considered a family value and where his mother was treated like a second-class citizen. She had been quietly using her skills as a former auditor to gather these financial records for months, just waiting for the right moment to strike. She leaned closer to me in the cold car. "They think because we are women, we will just smile and serve them," she said quietly. "They think you will surrender because you are afraid of a public scandal, and they think I will stay silent because I am afraid of losing my lifestyle. But I saw the way you dropped that microphone, Chloe. You are not going to surrender. You are going to dismantle them completely, and I am going to help you do it." I flipped to the very last page in the heavy folder, and my blood turned to absolute ice. It was a wire transfer confirmation from the commercial lender. $2 million of the $5 million bridge loan had already been dispersed into a Sterling Holdings account early that morning. I looked at Zoe in complete disbelief. I asked her how this was even possible when the bank strictly required both of us to sign the final documents in person today. Zoe shook her head. She explained that Julian did not wait for the paperwork. He sent the loan officer the highly edited video of the wedding reception. He used the footage of the ceremony to prove that we were legally married and that the spousal asset alignment was officially finalized. The bank approved the emergency initial release based on his promise to deliver the physical signatures by the end of the week. My immediate instinct was to grab my phone and dial the police. I wanted Julian in handcuffs for wire fraud and forgery right then and there. But as I reached for my purse, I stopped. My corporate background kicked in and a terrifying reality washed over me. If I reported a massive federal bank fraud today, the authorities would immediately freeze every single asset tied to the loan while they investigated. That included Apex Medical Billing, my company, my life work. The federal government would lock my accounts for years. My employees would lose their jobs and my business would go completely bankrupt waiting for a trial. Julian knew exactly what he was doing. He had cornered me. I could not just play the victim and go to the cops. I could not blow the whistle yet. I had to outsmart him. I had to find a way to take my company off that loan and steal the power back from the inside. I looked down at the forged documents in my lap, and a completely insane plan began to form in my mind. I drove straight back to my office and walked into the conference room where Harper was waiting. I dropped the stolen financial ledger onto the glass table. Harper reviewed the forged signature and the wire transfer receipt. I told her we could not go to the authorities yet because the federal government would freeze Apex medical billing during the investigation, and I would lose everything I built. Harper looked at me and asked what my plan was. I told her we were going to give Julian exactly what he wanted. We were going to give him a broken and submissive wife. In the corporate world, when a competitor tries a hostile takeover, you do not scream and you do not panic. You study their weaknesses. Julian had a massive ego. He had spent his entire life being told he was superior simply because of his last name. He expected me to be hysterical. He expected me to be terrified by the fake reviews and the restraining order. An arrogant enemy is a careless enemy, and I was about to use his pride against him. I picked up my phone and dialed his number. I took a deep breath, forced my voice to tremble, and let out a soft and pathetic sob just as he answered. Julian spoke my name with a cold and victorious sneer. He sounded like a man who had just won a war. I did not break character. I cried into the phone. I told him I was so sorry. I told him the media backlash was destroying my company and that I could not handle the stress anymore. I begged him to drop the restraining order. I told him I knew I overreacted at the wedding and that I just wanted to sit down privately and fix things without going to court. There was a long pause on the line. I could practically hear his ego inflating. He told me that I had embarrassed his family and that forgiveness would come with a very high price. I forced myself to choke back another fake sob. I told him I would sign whatever settlement he wanted as long as we could do it quietly. I promised to be reasonable. Julian took the bait completely. His arrogance made him completely blind to the trap I was setting. He agreed to let me come to his office the next morning to negotiate a private settlement. He thought he had successfully broken my spirit. He had absolutely no idea he was inviting a predator right into his own headquarters. The next morning, I walked into the grand lobby of Sterling Holdings. From the outside, it looked like a fortress of untouchable wealth, with its polished marble floors and towering glass walls. But thanks to the leaked documents, I knew the truth. I was walking into a dying empire. I took the private elevator to the executive floor and was escorted into a massive mahogany boardroom. Julian and Beatrice were already sitting at the head of the long table. They looked incredibly smug. Beatrice wore a tailored designer suit and a triumphant smirk, as if she had just won a war. Julian was relaxed, leaning back in his expensive leather chair, like a king waiting for a peasant to beg for mercy. I kept my head slightly lowered, playing the part of the terrified and exhausted bride they fully expected to see. Beatrice did not even offer me a seat. She simply slid a thick legal document across the polished wood table. She told me it was a standard reconciliation agreement. She said that if I signed it, they would immediately drop the restraining order and release a public statement clearing my name in the media. I picked up the pen with a trembling hand and slowly turned the pages, pretending to be too emotionally overwhelmed to read the fine print. But my eyes were scanning every single paragraph with absolute laser focus. Harper had warned me exactly what to look for. And there it was, buried deep on page 14, inside a dense block of confusing legal jargon. It was a retroactive asset alignment clause. It was explicitly designed to legally validate and authorize the forged $5 million bridge loan. If I signed this document, I would legally hand over Apex Medical Billing to cover their massive corporate bankruptcy, and I would never be able to accuse them of fraud. Julian stood up and walked around the table. He stopped right behind my chair and placed his heavy hands on my shoulders. I had to force my entire body not to flinch at his touch. He leaned down and whispered that I had made a terrible and embarrassing mistake at our wedding. But then his voice softened into a sickening and patronizing tone. He told me that he still loved me despite my flaws. He said he would forgive everything I had done, and we could go back to having a perfect life together. All I had to do was sign the paper and finally learn how to be a good and obedient wife. I kept my shoulders slumped and let out a shaky breath. Julian patted my back, completely convinced he had broken me. I reached into my purse and pulled out my own pen. Harper had given it to me that morning. I hovered the gold tip over the thick paper and let my hand tremble for their entertainment. When I finally pressed the pen to the paper, I did not sign my legal name. I signed a highly specific and legally invalid variation of my signature. Harper and I had already registered this exact incorrect signature as a known forgery trigger with every major bank I used. If Julian tried to enforce this document to steal my company, the bank systems would instantly flag it as a fraudulent corporate takeover. But I could not just sign it and walk away. I needed to buy exactly 7 more minutes. While Julian and Beatrice were busy gloating in the boardroom, Zoe was 2 floors below us in the executive accounting suite. She was logged into the Sterling Holdings master servers, using her husband's U.S. dormant administrative credentials. She was bypassing their security firewalls and downloading the real financial ledgers. She was gathering the hidden offshore accounts, the fake vendor invoices, and the undeniable proof of their massive money laundering operation. And she was not just putting it on a flash drive. She was routing the entire data dump directly into the secure digital tip lines of the FBI and the Securities and Exchange Commission. I let the pen slip from my fingers. It rolled across the polished mahogany table. I buried my face into my hands and forced myself to sob loudly. Beatrice rolled her eyes and let out a loud sigh of disgust. Julian tapped his fingers impatiently and told me to pull myself together. I apologized profusely, playing the pathetic victim. I rambled about how stressed I was and how much I wanted to fix our relationship just to waste minute after agonizing minute. I begged Beatrice to forgive me for ruining the wedding. I asked Julian pointless questions about the public statement he promised to release. I dragged the conversation out, making them sit there and listen to my fake tears while their entire corporate empire was being exported to the federal government right beneath their feet. Finally, I felt a single sharp vibration from the smartwatch on my left wrist. It was the signal from Zoe. The upload was 100% complete. The trap was set, and the authorities had everything they needed. I took a deep breath, sniffled, and wiped my completely dry eyes. I picked up the pen one last time, smoothly finished the invalid signature, and pushed the heavy legal document across the table. Julian snatched the thick document from the table before the ink was even dry. A slow, arrogant smirk spread across his face as he inspected the signature. He actually believed he had won. He looked over at Beatrice and ordered her to contact their public relations team immediately. He wanted a press release drafted within the hour, announcing that his confused bride had officially admitted her mistakes and begged for the forgiveness of the Sterling family. He proudly declared that this weekend they would host a massive redemption gala. It was a perfectly calculated move. He planned to use the high-profile charity event to parade me around like a broken trophy, prove to the world that his family reputation was spotless and secretly secure, new wealthy investors to keep his sinking company afloat now that he thought he had my assets as collateral. He looked down at me, fully expecting me to keep my head bowed in absolute submission. Instead, I slowly stood up from the heavy leather chair. The fake tears were completely gone. I did not look terrified, and I certainly did not look defeated. I looked him straight in the eyes and let a small, completely unbothered smile form on my face. I smoothed out the front of my jacket and looked at the arrogant man who thought he had just successfully stolen my entire life. "That is exactly right, Julian," I said, my voice dropping the pathetic act and returning to absolute ice. "I will see you at the gala." The ballroom of the Grand Hotel was packed with the absolute elite of the New York financial world. The Sterling family had spared no expense for their highly publicized redemption gala. Photographers clustered near the entrance, taking pictures of socialites and hedge fund managers as waiters circulated with trays of expensive champagne. But because of the leaked documents, I knew the real truth about the guest list. Half the people in this opulent room were not friends or supporters. They were nervous creditors and aggressive investors that Julian desperately needed to convince. He needed them to believe his empire was still highly profitable and secure. Beatrice was holding court near the center of the room. She was wearing a custom emerald gown and dripping in heavy diamond jewelry that most likely belonged to a bank. She was laughing loudly and accepting premature congratulations on saving her family name. She looked incredibly proud of herself, fully believing that she had successfully crushed my spirit and stolen my company. The string quartet slowly faded out as the bright stage lights illuminated the front of the room. Julian stepped up to the crystal podium, looking like the perfect wealthy heir in a sharp velvet tuxedo. He tapped the microphone and smiled a practiced and charming smile. The room instantly quieted down. He looked out at the sea of wealthy investors and began his deeply hypocritical speech. He spoke about the heavy burdens of family legacy and the harsh pressures of the corporate world. He talked about how true love requires immense patience and how a strong man must always be willing to forgive a confused and emotional wife. He was laying the exact groundwork to introduce me to the crowd. He wanted me to walk up to that podium, publicly apologize for my behavior at the wedding, and prove to his anxious creditors that my massive medical billing company was officially tied to his sinking ship. He paused for dramatic effect, waiting for the polite applause to die down. He looked toward the heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom, fully expecting me to walk in wearing a demure dress, with my head bowed, ready to perform my ultimate submission. Julian smiled and gestured toward the back of the room, waiting for my pathetic entrance. The heavy mahogany doors swung open, but I was not wearing a demure gown, and I certainly did not have my head bowed. I walked into the ballroom wearing a razor-sharp crimson business suit. I was not alone. My lawyer, Harper Reed, walked on my right side. Flanking us were 6 men and women in dark suits who did not look like wealthy gala guests. They were federal agents from the FBI and the Securities and Exchange Commission. The polite applause died instantly. The room fell into a stunned, breathless silence. I walked straight down the center aisle, keeping my eyes locked on Julian. The arrogant smirk completely vanished from his face, replaced by sheer white-hot panic. He gripped the edges of the crystal podium as I walked up the velvet steps. He stepped forward, trying to block me, but 2 federal agents smoothly stepped in front of him, forcing him back away from the stand. I reached out and took the microphone. It was the exact same move I made at our wedding, but this time I was not just ending a reception. I was ending an empire. I looked out at the crowd of wealthy investors and nervous creditors. I told them to look at the massive digital screens behind the stage. On my cue, the Sterling Holdings corporate logo vanished. It was instantly replaced by a massive high-definition projection of a highly confidential financial document. Gasps echoed across the ballroom as the financial elite of New York read the bold print. It was a formal notice of default and corporate acquisition. I spoke clearly and calmly into the microphone. I told the room that Julian Sterling had built his entire speech on a massive lie. I explained that Sterling Holdings was entirely bankrupt and had been hiding toxic debt for 8 months using illegal offshore accounts. The investors in the front row began murmuring in absolute horror. Then I delivered the final devastating blow. I told them that Julian had forged my signature to secure a $5 million bridge loan using my medical billing company as collateral. He thought he was trapping me, but his arrogance made him legally sloppy. I explained that by illegally forging my name as a co-founder and co-guarantor on the loan, he accidentally gave me full legal standing over the debt. Harper and I had gone straight to the bank. When we proved the forgery and the massive fraud, the commercial lender panicked. To avoid a catastrophic federal scandal, they fully cooperated with my legal team. They allowed my company to activate a highly obscure emergency hostile takeover clause. I turned my body and looked Julian dead in the eyes, watching his entire reality shatter into a million pieces. I spoke into the microphone so the entire room could hear. I announced that I had just legally acquired every single ounce of the Sterling Holdings bad debt. I was no longer his terrified bride. I was officially the absolute largest creditor of his entire family. I told him that I now owned his holding company. I owned the corporate accounts. I owned the very chairs the guests were sitting on. I looked down at Beatrice, who was standing frozen in her emerald gown, her face entirely drained of color. I smiled at her and announced that as of 1 hour ago, I had officially initiated foreclosure on her sprawling luxury estate. The Sterling family had tried to force me to serve them. Now I was liquidating them. The silence in the ballroom lasted exactly 1 second before Julian completely snapped. The polished investment director vanished entirely, and the violent, entitled coward I saw at our wedding took over. He let out a primal scream of pure, unhinged rage. He lunged across the stage, his hand raised high, aiming directly for my face. He wanted to strike me for the 3rd time. He wanted to silence me by brute force, just like he had tried to do at the altar. He did not even make it a single step. Before I could even flinch, the federal agents moved with terrifying speed. 2 undercover FBI agents grabbed him by the shoulders and swept his legs completely out from under him. Julian slammed face first onto the hardwood floor of the stage right next to the crystal podium. The sound of his expensive tuxedo tearing was instantly drowned out by the heavy metallic click of steel handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists. He thrashed on the ground, screaming that he was a Sterling and demanding that his lawyers be called. He yelled that they had no right to touch him. The lead agent simply knelt down, pressing a knee firmly into Julian back to keep him pinned. The agent voice boomed over the absolute chaos in the ballroom, loudly announcing the federal charges. Julian was placed under immediate arrest for wire fraud, federal bank document forgery, and massive corporate embezzlement. I looked down at him as they hauled him roughly to his feet. His face was red, his suit was covered in dust, and his arrogant pride was completely shattered in front of the entire New York financial elite. He looked pathetic. The wealthy investors and creditors in the audience did not try to help him. They were already pulling out their phones, calling their legal teams, and sprinting for the exit, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Sterling name. Down on the floor, Beatrice collapsed into a chair, hyperventilating as the terrifying reality of her new life finally set in. She was ruined. Because I now controlled the debt. She had no house, no company, and no secret trust fund left to pay for a high-priced defense attorney. The mighty Sterling family empire did not just crumble. It was completely obliterated in less than 5 minutes. They thought they could use tradition and violence to break my spirit and steal my money. Instead, they handed me the exact weapon I needed to tear their entire legacy to the ground. The legal fallout was swift and absolutely brutal. Because Zoe had handed over the master server data, the federal prosecutors had an airtight case. Julian did not even make it to a dramatic trial. His high-priced defense lawyers abandoned him the second they realized the Sterling corporate accounts were completely frozen. Cornered by the undeniable proof of his forgery and embezzlement, he was forced to take a plea deal. The judge sentenced him to 8 solid years in a federal penitentiary. In the United States federal prison system, there is no early parole for white-collar crimes. He will serve every single day of those 8 years behind bars. He traded his custom velvet tuxedos for a standard-issue jumpsuit, and the arrogant man who thought he could control women with physical violence is now told exactly when to wake up, when to eat, and when to speak. As for Beatrice, her reality completely shattered. When I legally executed the hostile takeover and called in the bad debts, I immediately foreclosed on her sprawling luxury estate. The federal government seized her designer furniture, her luxury cars, and her expensive jewelry to pay back the defrauded investors. With the family name entirely radioactive, her elite social circle abandoned her overnight. Her exclusive country club membership was immediately revoked, and her wealthy friends suddenly stopped answering her phone calls. The cruel woman who once tried to force me to wear a cheap servant apron in front of 200 guests now lives in a cramped one-bedroom rental apartment on the outskirts of the city. She has no trust fund, no staff, and absolutely no power. She spends her days entirely alone, stripped of the only thing she ever truly cared about, which was her false sense of superiority. Zoe did not just help me take down the Sterling Empire. She completely rewrote her own future. When she handed over the master server data to the federal authorities, she officially became a government whistleblower. Under federal financial laws, whistleblowers who expose massive corporate fraud are entitled to a significant percentage of the recovered stolen assets. When the government seized and liquidated the hidden Sterling accounts, Zoe received a massive financial reward for her bravery and cooperation. She did not use the money to buy a luxury estate or designer clothes to fit in with the elite. She used it to build her own power. Zoe opened her own independent auditing firm right in the heart of Manhattan. She now spends her days dismantling corrupt companies instead of quietly suffering inside one. Her personal life changed just as drastically. The moment Julian was arrested, Zoe handed her husband Pierce a signed divorce agreement. Pierce tried to fight her in court, but his legal standing was completely destroyed. Because he had blindly allowed his mother and brother to use his name on the fraudulent board of directors, he was deeply entangled in the federal investigation. The family court judge did not hesitate for a single second. Zoe was granted full, absolute custody of her young son. She walked out of that courtroom a completely free woman. She protected her child from growing up in a toxic environment where cruelty and manipulation were disguised as family tradition. Zoe and I did not just become business allies. We became living proof that when women stop trying to quietly survive at a corrupt table and decide to flip it over completely, they can build an entirely new empire from the wreckage. I am standing in my massive corner office at the newly expanded headquarters for Apex Medical Billing. The floor-to-ceiling windows offer a completely unobstructed view of the New York City skyline. The sun is setting, casting a warm golden light over the buildings and reflecting off the glass towers. I take a slow sip of my coffee and walk over to my large desk. Sitting right on the corner is a heavy wooden shadow box frame. Inside the thick glass is the cheap white lace apron Beatrice tried to force me to wear on my wedding day. Mounted directly beneath the fabric is a small silver plaque that reads, "The $5 million refusal." Harper had the apron framed for me as a victory gift, after the hostile takeover was officially finalized. For a few months I kept it in my office as a stark reminder of the exact moment I realized my own absolute strength. It was proof that I survived the worst betrayal of my life and came out on top. But looking at it today, I realize I do not need a physical reminder anymore. I do not need to keep trophies of my trauma, and I absolutely do not need to hold on to any part of the toxic Sterling family legacy. I pick up the heavy frame and walk it over to my assistant, who is waiting near the door. I tell her to deliver it directly to the organizers of a major charity gala happening this weekend. The organization raises money to provide legal and financial resources for women escaping domestic violence and financial abuse. I tell my assistant to let them auction off the framed apron and the story behind it to the highest bidder. I know the wealthy women of New York will pay a fortune for the ultimate symbol of corporate revenge. I do not need it taking up space in my office or my mind ever again. As my assistant carries the frame out the door, I turn back to the massive windows and look out at the city skyline. I feel completely light and entirely free. On my wedding day, they ordered me to put on a cheap white apron and serve 30 men. I did exactly what they asked. I served every single corrupt man on their board of directors straight to federal prison. And when I was completely finished with that, I sat down at the head of the table and served myself an empire.